Okay, first I'd like to thank both Professor Dean and Professor Mocnik for offering such a compelling and powerful description of processes of social change. And of course, one talk is almost the obverse of the other, because one of them describes the crowd as the possibility for a gap in the control of state and capital, of course, in the direction of revolution, whereas the other, Professor Mocnik described a process of a kind of disciplining and conditioning of the people by capitalism with very, very reactionary effects. I think there are 3 points that I'd like to raise, that I quickly thought of, inspired by these two talks. The first one is on the question of the crowd, and particularly the theoretical infrastructure for the understanding of the crowd coming from Alain Badiou's book, Theory of the Subject, which was a series of lectures, I think from 1977 to 79, published in, I think, 81. And one of the things that I thought of right away when I was thinking of Badiou's treatment of mass activity and the crowd is in that period of his action, he sometimes used the slogan, "Everything that moves isn't red," which rhymes in French. The idea being that not everything in the streets, not everything that seems to be happening politically is necessarily progressive, is necessarily leftist, right? And that was his criticism of the Gauche Prolétarienne, which was the largest Maoist group at that time, and which he felt was too spontaneous, insufficiently structured, etc. And that was also at that time his criticism of Deleuze, who at that point in his career he accused of a kind of crypto-fascism, in fact, precisely because he felt in this 1970s moment there was this, things had become too ecstatic, right? Now, and in many ways I thought that Professor Dean was very sensitive to this concern, so I don't think that she was unfaithful to Badiou. But on the other hand, one thing that I was considering in terms of this question about a kind of ambivalence of the crowd, right? Like sometimes it is revolutionary and progressive, other times it's a kind of mob violence, or it's just a spectacle, right? One way I think of thinking about that might be the question of class character, which I felt like was maybe not foregrounded as much, so one of Marx's insights could be said to be that the social totality, right, is split by class struggle, right? So the people doesn't function as a unified, homogeneous mass, but rather class underlies and splits, right, social unity. And I think he holds that work even into his later work, right? Like, for example, in his interview with Bruno Bastiels, he expresses a lot of skepticism about the protests attendant to globalization in the early, about 10 years ago, precisely because he sees them as too predictable, insufficiently attentive to the figure of the worker, right? And he frequently has talked about the need to kind of resuscitate a figure of working class action, rather than other things that have come along to replace it, right? So that question of a kind of lack of activity on the part of a working class movement, I don't know if the crowd or the people or these other concepts can replace that from that point of view. And one concrete example that I thought of was towards the end of last year in Budapest, there were a number of protests actually against the current government, sparked by this internet tax. And at first it was very exciting. There were really lots of people in the street. But they kind of fizzled out and they didn't really contribute anything politically. And that might be because there wasn't a party, there wasn't a political force to channel that, but it might also be because of the initial class character of the protests wasn't necessarily coming from the laboring masses. Maybe it was a lot of people in the streets, but not necessarily. So that question of class, or to use the language of the early Negri, right, the question of class composition, not somebody who Badiou is a big fan of, but this notion of like, what is the working class today? I don't know if that question, can be covered up by these other concepts. Okay, the second question I wanted to ask about was that in Professor Dean's talk, I thought there was a lot of attention to what it feels like to be a crowd, the kind of mass psychological experience of crowd activity. And in Professor Mocnik's talk, I thought there was less about that dimension of collective experience. And so it made me think, well, how does it feel to be in a classical fascist situation or a post-fascist situation or a neo-fascist situation, right? And one thing that it made me think of, I think a kind of classic study of at least the classical fascist notion of that is in Georges Bataille, of course, who was attended Kojève's lectures, strong influence on Lacan, who of course is a huge influence on Badiou. So I think maybe a useful interlocutor. for this conversation. And Bataille emphasized in classical fascism a kind of collective effervescence, destructiveness, mob violence, right? And Bataille, as a result, kind of felt that in a way, both revolutionary and reactionary experiences involved this kind of recognition of mass violence. And Bataille even wanted to uncover the potentially progressive aspects of destruction in the same way that Bedju did, in the same way that Jodi Dean just talked about. But he also saw that kind of destructiveness could be captured by fascism. And in some ways, he thought that's what classical fascism was. It was a capturing of the destructive capacities of the masses by authoritarianism, right? Now, it seems to me that in neo-fascism and in post-fascism, that feeling of collective effervescence seems to go away, and instead there's a kind of feeling of exhaustion, I think. But I mean, I don't know. You could say there are forms of consumer culture, right, that are maybe included in post-fascism that maybe do have that feeling of excitement and activity. I'm not really sure, but so it's a question that I've been mulling over, and I mean at this point I don't have an answer, but I'm curious about what other people think about that. The third point, and the third and final point, and I'll finish with this, that I was thinking of, was I felt that in Jodi Dean's talk there was a lot of emphasis on the contingency of the situation, on a kind of opening that could kind of go either way. It could fizzle out, or it could be the moment could be seized by a political process, by a party, right? So very much a sense of the aleatory, a sense of chance, a sense of conditions of possibility, but not necessarily. Okay, whereas in contrast, I felt that in Professor Mocnik's talk, there was more of a sense of historical necessity or determinism, precisely because there was more of attentiveness to class conditions and things like that. And so as a result, it appeared more that in certain circumstances, the only thing that could happen would be fascism, neo-fascism, or post-fascism, right? That there would be no other direction. And so I found myself wondering, I don't know, maybe if the conjuncture was maybe a little bit more open than it was being than the way it was being presented, like maybe, I mean, it made me wonder, maybe just because I'm hoping for some kind of hope in the current situation, you know, whether there's some way of reversing or adopting alternative responses to these admittedly very, very challenging circumstances of neoliberalism and the kind of failed attempt to compose the national bourgeoisie, decomposition and falling apart of workers' organizations. I mean, I just wondered if that ends up in the consequence of fascism inevitably, right? Or whether there are political processes that could retard or reverse that. Okay, those are the things that I would like to say.
I suggest that we switch now from Professor Dean and Professor Mocnik.
Do you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess we're also using this as the opening for a big group discussion, right? So we'll have maybe brief responses and then open this all up.
Yeah,
yes,
and
good.
we will then join you.
Cool, great. Okay. So the one thing that I wanted to respond to from Comrade Andrew's questions was you were asking about the working class today, right? And the way I want to try to understand this, or the way I'm trying to theorize what the relationship between crowd and party, is to recognize that working class, even in classical Marxism, was not simply a demographic kind of category, right? Proletarianization is a process. People can move into or out of a class category. And so I want to think about, I would take seriously proletarianization as a phenomenon that continues to happen and is happening even worse under contemporary capitalism. So that would be a part of the class analysis, but recognize that we don't know in advance what a crowd is, what its demography is, what its basis is, but we can retroactively present it as something in one direction rather than another direction. So if we recognize that proletarianization is happening, we recognize that crowds amass in all sorts of different kinds of ways, let's push it in the way we want it to go, rather than say, well, I think those people are basically this, or they're a bunch of scattered hippies or whatever. Let's say, no, let's recognize in the movements of crowd already the movement of the proletarianized people. I want to say, and I was a little bit worried that my comments didn't seem exactly like on point, but I want to remind everyone from session 1 in our program, the last sentence in the description says, how might we sustain hope in a world that desperately struggles to prevent the return of the worst of all possible pasts? And I think we can actually see the hope out there already sustaining itself in these mass movements that we've seen of crowds amassing over the last 5 or 6 years. So there's hope there. Think a better structure for letting the hope transfer into political gains, letting it become visible as the movement of the people, having a left that also, basically a left that hasn't given up on the people completely, would help on this score.
Okay, thank you. I was amused, and I think your comments are very much to the point and very witty and intelligent. I would first comment on Bataille and this opposition you made between historical fascism, which was a hot movement, and the cold, frigid neo and post-fascism. And I think this is a good observation that should be developed. Now, Bataille was probably the last person who believed in sociology, and he defined the central, or even the only problem of sociology to be le sacré, the sacred. Now, I would say that the sacred in Durkheimian and Moss's sense works in historical fascism, and that its disappearance, it's probably, or perhaps it has disappeared, that we could articulate this problem with what Boudin says, what Boudin writes about disappearance of society. There is no such a thing as society. Boris Boudin quotes Mrs. Thatcher, and he actually argues in favor of this proposition. So maybe it has to do with that Le Sacré that was very much alive in Massenpsychologie has vanished, and that we have a different kind of different types, and that could be linked to the practices, to those extremely brutal but also frigid practices of Dewesh, so-called ISIS in Orientalist terms. Of the Caliphate, where you have this kind of extreme violence performed in a frigid way, without. It's not this Bataille's sacrifice, not at all. So I'm only here recognizing the relevance of this question. I don't have an answer, and I'm glad that you brought in Bataille, because I'm a sociologist, so that's one of my patrons. Now, on the other hand, this counterposition of contingency and determinism. Look, if you have to explain the last 100 years in 30 minutes, you are more or less bound to be deterministic. But then, seriously speaking, I have not stressed enough, underlined enough the conjuncture moment, that several heterogeneous processes have to come together to produce a certain effect, which is not in the program of any one of them. That's what's happening usually in society, and fascism is such an effect. And one could give an example. For instance, the coalescence of neo-fascism happened in Croatia under Tudjman, while it actually didn't happen in Serbia, because Milosevic's authoritarianism was keeping Chetniks and this literary movement, Srpski pokret obnov, the Serbian renovation movement, marginalized them. So you had an authoritarian regime, but not fascist, and you had a strong push towards fascism, like Drašković in his early times before he has become foreign minister of Yugoslavia, and the Chetnik movement, Chechen, for example, but the coalescence didn't occur. So, but in situations that were more or less the same, and maybe even Serbia had much more objective conditions fulfilled for good historical neo-fascism. And still didn't happen, and it's bizarre. It's a kind of bizarre thesis to say that Milosevic saved Serbia from fascism, but by introducing a kind of authoritarian regime, which was actually for a certain period one-party authoritarian regime, even though it was parliamentary. It ended with electoral fraud. I accept this criticism, this cowardly criticism. I make autocritique, and I think that's a good point. But basically, we should think in terms of conjuncture, in terms of a non-teleological production of effects, because what comes out is not programmed in advance.
We invite audience to come up with questions. Okay.
I'm a bit curious about this idea. You seem to be focusing on crowds that have no purpose or no political consciousness solely. So, but I'm talking to you, Jodi. You're excluding from this the climate change mob crowd. Are you purely talking about people who just kind of rise up with very little organized political agenda? Because there seems to be quite a lot of crowds that are gathering right now that do have an organized political agenda.
That's a good question. So what I'm trying to do is use the term crowd to refer to the affective intensities or the dynamic that come about in the sort of mass numbers of people together in a concentrated space. I don't want to call them all events, but so crowds can gather for lots of different reasons, like after a football match, they can in shopping frenzies, in organized political events. And one of the things that's interesting in them is that often they will exceed the situation that brought them together. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's just like, okay, we had a march and everybody came and protested and we said, oh, we marched for this, and then everybody went home, and people will be happy that it's a march. But I wouldn't call that an event. It didn't rupture what was expected. Instead, there was something about it that was a regular organized bit of behavior. And so by thinking about the dynamics of crowds, it's not that they are purposeless that I'm worried about or that I'm interested in. It's the way that their own dynamics can exceed the purpose that they think they have. And it's that moment of making the fact, then I call that the gap, right? So when the crowd exceeds it's what seemed to brought it together, then it installs a gap. And I think that's where, in the language that I aspire to, that's where the party says, oh, that's the people, trying to overthrow the state, or that's the people pushing back against capitalism. We might say that's also the job for left intellectuals. That's also the job for left artists, right? But I would say it's really what the party should do is to make present the people as they are disrupting the situations in which they find themselves. So the thing to keep in mind is crowds always exceed whatever purpose has brought them together.
My question basically pretty much a direct follow-up to that. It also seems to me in your description of the crowd that you were teasing out a kind of almost universal dimension to it. Also because you focused so specifically on the physical dimension, which I thought was also really beautiful, and I love the Keynes's part. I think there can be not enough eroticism in progressive politics, and we're totally missing that. So compliments for the kind of literary intervention there. But there does seem to be conflict between what you're now trying to make more precise as the crowd that has even a mental capacity, and the specific morphology of crowds that you were displaying on the screen, because these were as different as 1917 revolution, the anonymous movement, which is like a very strongly libertarian movement with anarchist dimension, but also with very strong right-wing tendencies. I recognize the Charlie Hebdo state-organized protest that you spoke specifically about, which seems very difficult, where it seems very difficult to tease, let's say, that crack out where the party steps in, because that seems to be the ultimate kind of counter-revolutionary or revisionist crowd compared to the Zapatistas, who do not seem to, which you also showed, which do not seem to fit that notion of crowd at all, because they're so strongly structured with a very articulated notion of indigenous socialism, etc. So that would be my question to you, like how does that universalizing of the crowd relate to that specific morphology of the crowd that you were displaying? And my question in length of your talk to Mr. Mocnik would be that, I mean, it's quite great to hear you speak today, because for years I've been invited to talk about your book and you're never there, so it's like wonderful to meet you in person, because it's like mythological presence for me by now. In length of, because I've talked so much about your book, in length of Dean's lecture, how much communism?
Oh, that's a great. How much communism?
Yeah.
So do we want to go ahead and answer, or are we going to gather?
Yeah, just,
okay.
I suggest you answer. And then
Okay. So the reason that I deliberately have pictures up there from different crowds with a different political content, because I'm trying to emphasize an affective intensity that exceeds the content. So I don't want to sort of, I don't want to like load the dice by having only the crowds I agree with, right? But it's like any crowd intensity exceeds what the people who put the crowd together want it to be, right? If it's this kind of crowd I'm talking about, if it can break through. So so it doesn't particularly matter what crowd event is there, because then we could just say, oh, that would be the same as people in a mall, or people at a football game, or people who went to this specific rally, and then those are already within the dominant frame of state and capital, permitted within that frame. But what happens when, and it does historically, and it's happened in the last 5 and 6 years, that we see that crowds exceed that, and you don't know what they are, and you don't know what the politics of them are, and how do we keep that energy alive so that we have this other kind of political space or opportunity. So the thing I want to keep emphasizing is it's not about the specific content of the crowd. Now this actually should be not a surprising thing, because in any group we feel the pressure of group dynamics, right? There's something about being in groups of other people where you can feel the sense of the room shift, you can feel if people are getting excited or angry or sad or bored or whatever. These dynamics aren't confined to specific kinds of content. So that's what I'm trying to reach out, and what I'm trying to grab onto. And the weird history of crowd theory, which kind of goes in cycles, because a lot of it's garbage. A lot of it emphasizes this weird dimension and uses terms like contagion and suggestion to capture the ways that these affective or unconscious dimensions of the crowd manifest itself. And so I was drawing on Canetti here, but actually Le Bon, even though he's horrible, has this weird way of thinking about the crowd in terms of its unconscious psychic effects. So crowd designates more of a process than it does an actual substance. It's a dynamic. Does that answer? Yeah. Oh, do you have a mic?
Yeah, okay. This works out. Now, how much communism? I would answer very simply. Communism is always there, and we don't notice it. Why do we don't notice it? Because it is a condition of our survival. If it were to vanish, we couldn't carry on, we couldn't live on. It's in this everyday gestures of mutual help and solidarity I couldn't think about a good example, but I will give you one from my own experience. When I had small children, I was driving them in those, how do you call it in English? La poussette in French.
Stroller.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, and it's difficult to get with a child on a bus with that. So there was always somebody who helped me. You know? And actually, when I started from my home, I counted that there will be somebody helping me, and it did. It did happen so. So that's what I call this basic communism, without which we could not survive. And it happens all the time. So that's my very simple, maybe a little pathetic, but simple answer.
Right, very quickly. In what Jodi Dean, in what you said about the crowds and the party, well, if indeed the International Communist Party, the child of our hopes, will come to be, how will that be mediated between the crowds and the party? What role could reason play there?
That's a great question. I'm going to have to think more about it systematically, because I think that my tendencies may be tendencies I might need to resist, because I think in my reflex is that the party is in this position of the role of reason, and that might not be the best answer. But I think that right now, as I'm thinking about it, the party holds open the gap that lets the collective desire for collectivity keep pushing itself as that collective desire, and it holds that open as a possibility. And this means that it has to emphasize the egalitarian dimension of the crowd, but not put itself in that place. And I think the criticism of parties that my position enables is parties inserted themselves in the gap of desire. They made themselves simply into the instrument for realizing it rather than the instrument for holding it open. And they tried to substitute their own desire for the egalitarian impulse of the collective. And so I think that these goals that I have in mind are probably goals that I would probably call goals of reason, but maybe I would want to qualify it. So right now, parties on the side would be on the side of reason.
Yeah, sure. Yes, the same. So the one is fine, Durkheim, and cognitive fine. What I was thinking about is multitude, which is sort of the term that people are using all the time, and I wonder how your concept of the crowd relates to that. And the other is about the demonstrations, basically the demonstrations in Budapest that you showed the images of. So I would say they are great. I mean, I've been there by now, but the point is that they are actually huge flash marks. That is, it has a precise date, a precise point, let's say date when you have to go there, a precise date when you finish, and it's very interesting. There is this excess you were speaking about, and that is when some of the people don't go home, but go in front of Parliament. They don't really know what to do there, but then they spend there, let's say, there's this big square, they spend there an hour and perhaps talk to each other. That's the best solution, but actually this excess cannot really channel in any way.
Those are great points. So on the multitude, what drives me crazy is in Hart and Negri's version, it's a multitude of singularities. And the element of collectivity is not there, right? It's almost like, and it's more like, I think, atomized masses. And you don't have the dynamic that emerges just from collective being together in the notion of multitude. So that's what crowds does. Also, crowds really, I think, is more material, in that it's not just like any old thing. Like multitudes, it seems like any old movement counts as, the movement of the multitude. With crowd, right? Because they're always like, oh, it comes up like a snake biting or something like this. With crowds, we feel their presence when they're there, and then we later will, interpret what happened or read what happened as something or not. Maybe it would be conventional, maybe it wouldn't be. But we won't just we can't, it's like I said, the crowd doesn't have a politics or it doesn't have a history. The party puts that back on there. Multitude is more ontological, as if it could be a politics by itself. So they don't have a space. I mean, they deliberately get rid of the space, I think, for something that like a party that we need. On the flash mobs, it's precisely because they don't know what to do afterwards, and the energy that they build, it just dissipates. But just think, if we have more organization that even says suggestions, okay, this is what you do when you get to Parliament, or demands of Parliament, oh, you saw the people there, they were making these demands, and the people, weren't, but you could still say that they were, right? So there's all sorts of organizational things that need to be attached to the energies that flash mobs recognize, but they're not able to channel.
Simon. Okay.
She doesn't want to answer.
Yeah, I have so many questions, but I would maybe like to return to what Andrew was saying in his response. First of all, was to try and connect or juxtapose those two propositions that we had with the crowd and the party on the one hand, and then the kind of analysis of the conjunctures that produce fascism. And I would suggest maybe doing it through 3 terms that I would like you to consider. And then at the end maybe distinguish it a bit post-fascism actually from the other 2 forms of fascism, which has to do with the notion of the crowd. And maybe that the 2 first forms of fascism that you described, historical fascism and new fascism, I think can both be described in terms of political movements that mobilizes a crowd.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that they do that not so much through the rational, but through affect. So I think affect would be a really interesting aspect to this conversation. And then I think that what might be interesting to discuss about the post-fascist proposition is that it doesn't seem to happen through a political movement or mobilization, but rather through political decision making from afar, from the elite. So it doesn't conjure up a party or a crowd that becomes a post-fascist. It's rather something that's implemented through political forms. So that would make it quite different as a political project than the others, I think, and therefore the ways to combat it would also be different. So I'm curious if we actually think that's the movement. And that will bring me to the second term, which is the notion of crisis. If we say this conjuncture is in shorthand called the moments of crisis, it's interesting that post-fascism is actually something that brings about a crisis. You could say that post-fascism is what brought about the financial crisis. So what is the response to that crisis? If it's the fascist tendency that produces the conjuncture that is crisis and not produced by it. Which brings me to the final point I would like you to consider is, of course, the notion of articulation. So in the moment of crisis, what is the possibilities for political articulation that can create, let's say, the new understanding of society in a way that does not give wind to the fascist movement, but rather, let's say, in terms of use the communist movement, in lack of other terms. And there, I think, again, the example of affect, and particularly the football clubs, was interesting, because you will notice that, of course, most football clubs have very right-wing supporters, but not only. And the very same activity, the very same being together, the very same affect, which is this strange kind of heteronormative homosexuality, can become articulated politically in different ways. So that's what I would like you to consider.
Well, all right, yeah, okay. Now, okay, I improvise. Those are very good questions and deserve much reflection, so I just improvise. As to the affect element, I would give you an orthodox Lacanian answer, which means that In Freudian terms, you have you have Vorstellungsrepräsentanz and Affektrepräsentanz. In Freudian, in Lacanian terms, every signifier is dragging behind a certain amount of affect. Now, signifiers can change, affect doesn't change. Affect actually transforms itself into anxiety. So, I would say that what you name the crowd is the affect moment. Now, what kind of signifier or representants will be stuck upon it is the question of politics, of contingency, of course, of existent political offer, and of what would be the operation of a party, of a progressive party. So that's why we don't end up as fascists, everybody. Because there's always affect around. The affect has this unpleasant tendency to tend towards anxiety, which is, I mean, the usual everyday shit we live in. Action in signifier, in Marxist terms, ideological action makes sense because it can channel the effects from destruction, from violence to something sensible. So that would be my kind of Freudian improvisation on that theme. Now about post-fascism and neo-fascism and crisis, I think that's a very productive insight. I think that the rule by the way of crisis is one of the great inventions of the late 20th century. You know, there are documents that show that the Thatcher government actually provoked crisis in order to stay in power. So that's an ingenious right-wing conservative, what you want, political invention. And most of the powers to be actually rely upon this. Domination by the crisis. I had some more, but okay, let's leave it for other times. Go ahead.
I thought that was super helpful and interesting for me. I'll flag a couple of things that come to mind, but that's a very rich question. So the first term was affect, right? That you mentioned. So I'll just put my cards on the table. So my goal in this project is to do a description of crowds in a way that makes all of the people into affect want to say, oh yeah, we've always been Marxist and communist. That's right. I mean, I want to kidnap all of the rhetoric that people who are tending towards Deleuze and who do affect theory. I'm trying to just absorb it all and make this persuasive. I actually happen to be. It's not just a device. I'm actually convinced by it because that's what I think that the cool thing that the crowd idea lets us do is bring these sort of theoretical ideas together. So for me, the whole project is one that is putting affect to work. I want to say just one thing on the crisis, he rightly pointed out that how conservatives have used crisis. People may have read already Naomi Klein's book on This Changes Everything, the climate change book, and one of there are good things and bad things, and it. One of the cool things is that she uses the term people's shock. And so it's like in response to the shock doctrine that neoliberalism has used over the last 30 or 40 years to expand market operations and financialization and privatization in ever more territories, she says, why can't we let climate change be the opportunity for a people's shock? And I think that the term is great and evocative as saying, wait a minute, yeah, it's not just conservatives who can use crisis, right? That can also be an opportunity for all sorts of left advance. If we actually have a left that believes in communism and a left that's willing to organize again, rather than a left that's just going to complain. So I think that the opportunity for turning a crisis into a people shock is real, But that depends on the left now starting again to have confidence in the people and recognize that for the people to manifest themselves in history, in the world, we need to have organization and interpretation that will let that happen.
Daniel, I will sit here so that I can see who wants to.
A quick question for Rastko, and then one for Jodi. The problem with fascism seems to be actually sort of rather simple. I mean, fascism is a bourgeois response to the threat of a working class revolution. No revolution, no threat of a working class revolution, no fascism. So what we see in neo-fascism or post-fascism are bourgeois liberal approximations of fascism. But the bourgeoisie has no need to resort to those extreme measures if a knife is not against its throat, a form of a working class revolution. So the weakness in the left that we all bemoan is the prime reason why there is no overt classical fascist threat at this moment. And just for Jodi, crowds come in all shapes and sizes. There are lynch mobs, there are pogroms. Crowds can be positive, negative. It seems to me there's someone talking about crowds without describing what kind of crowds they are. Strikes me as a step towards depoliticization of the phenomenon. And what has really impressed many of us over the last decade is how ephemeral and ineffectual crowds are. There were massive demonstrations in 2002 against the Rastko Mocnik 2003 against the invasion of Iraq. There were, of course, the Arab Spring. The first had no effect, the war machine barreled on regardless. And the second, you could maybe argue that it actually made things worse. So crowds, I'm just finding myself increasingly unimpressed by momentary formations of crowds. And perhaps maybe we could discuss the difference between a crowd and say a mass strike, where a mass strike is a crowd with a purpose. Purpose of shutting down industry, of exerting working class control as the first step towards a working class revolution.
Okay, so I will keep saying the same thing over and over again. It's not the content of the crowd that is, I would say, that's interesting. It's the fact that there are crowd dynamics. And crowd dynamics can go in different directions. So you're right that that the crowd is ambiguous. I would say that it's not that it's depoliticized. I'd say it's an opportunity for politics. And whether or not that opportunity is going to be taken is going to depend on other political forces, what I'm calling the party, right? To push the crowd in one direction rather than another. The crowds some crowds have been ineffective and ephemeral because there's not been an organization capable of pushing them in a good direction. I think you're wrong to say the Arab Spring had no effect. I think that's a crazy thing to say, right? It's clear, you said, I thought you said no effect. I wouldn't go. First, I would disagree with no effect, which is what I thought you said. I wouldn't accept negative effect. I would say that it opened up politics. It politicized people. It let them have a sense of action on the ground that they had been lacking. So I wouldn't go with I wouldn't disregard the opening of the Arab Spring, even in the face of counter-revolution. The one other thing you said, and this has actually it's been making me nervous because I was thinking it could be one repercussion of the conjuncture between our two ideas here, is that the weakness of the left is why there has not been organized fascism in the way that you mentioned, right? But I think that we've got another answer, which is that post-fascism is using liberal bourgeois law. And that, in fact, because this post-fascism is using liberal law, the crowds have a different opportunity, and this is what I think your comment was opening up to, Simon. The crowds have a different opportunity to manifest possible emancipatory energies if there is a party capable of interpreting that way, because they're not being channeled necessarily yet in a fascist direction. There's not the mobbiness that there was in the 20s and 30s. And I want to think that that's the direction that having this analysis of how liberal bureaucratic apparatuses are in fact enabling, let's say, a fascism from above, or a fascism of, of particular kinds of law today.
I think that Egypt developments in Egypt confirm Jodi's thesis. I mean, the crowd was subverted or overthrew a regime, okay, but then who profited? Those who were working for decades on penetrating Egyptian society, and then won democratic elections. So that's actually what you say. Huh? On the other hand, I mean, I thought I was pessimistic. Now, saying that the weakness of the left is the reason why there is no fascism is even more pessimistic. But look, a weakness of the left can work both ways. Right. And if you have a strong left, you can hardly get a massive support for fascist regime. You can get some support, but not massive, not enthusiastic. So I think there must be more factors brought in.
What about Germany in the late 20s?
What?
Germany late 20s.
20s. There was a strong left.
Yeah.
And fascism was pretty successful, wasn't it?
Okay, yeah, but that's, let's say, the left was split.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And both were happy to beat each other, so... yeah.
There are more questions. May I probably suggest, Anna, if you like, and Kasia, you come together and we open the large panel, discussing among us and with the crowd. So, if you like, please go ahead.
Can I still connect to this crowd question, which seems to touch a lot of interest, because you are emphasizing that you are not really interested in the content, but I think the composition of the crowd is a crucial issue. And many of the people who commented said this already, but also Andrew Ryder started with this example of this internet tax demonstration in Budapest, or if you think about the very mixed groups here at the Maidan and discredited the revolution there, or if we think about the Roșia Montana demonstrations in Romania, which also were composed of very nationalistic groups and very leftist groups. I would like to ask you maybe what happens if we have, if there is this crisis on which finally the people go to the street, and it's also both the left and the nationalists or the right wing people. How do we deal with these masses if they don't disappear?
Well, that's the struggle, right? I mean, I'm not. Maybe I don't completely get the question, because if there are masses of people out on the streets with different political goals, they fight it out. And part of what determines who wins is how organized they are. What is the perception in the media? What are their own? What are their voices doing? What are their? How did their symbols capture the popular imagination? But it's going to be. It's an opportunity and an opening for political struggle. Right? But that's all. It's the thing to keep in mind, right? Is that whenever we've got these big crowds that appear somewhere, they don't all agree with one another. They don't begin from some kind of common place. There are all sorts of different views that are going to be present there. How the crowd manifests later on, right? So in like the next day or in the media, or 2 weeks later, is part of the political struggle over the crowd. But I think it's crucial to keep in mind that, and like you said, you even said in your answer, well, there were mixed groups of people in them. I mean, in your comment, right? That's right. And what I'm trying to do is let us hold on to that mixed group, recognize that there's still an intensity and an energy that gives off, and use that as the opportunity for pushing the crowd event in a left follow
To say that I think it's difficult because it discredits a certain movement, and then people cannot identify with it anymore. If it turns out that the people beside me are actually having very different.
No, that presupposes that people only go out if they think that everybody automatically agrees with them, and that's not the case. No.
Wait a minute.
And it presupposes that you know what everybody is already thinking out there, rather than the fact that that people will be present because they're, happy, upset, angry, their friends go. And then that will, let's say, think of a churning possibility, right? It's not a kind of flat, we know why everyone is there and why. In fact, social science-y kind of data says that most people go to big protests because their friends go, right? But that doesn't mean that they know that the other people are there or why they're there, or that they have the same goals in being there, or that they have the same goals for the event.
Well, I don't know whether this is an argument, but I want to share something in, continuing what Dora has said. We all have this experience of this wave of demonstrations last autumn. Why did I stop to go to those demonstrations? Mm-hmm. Because I did stop, absolutely, but I wouldn't go again. There was one thing that those crowds were absolutely unified and adamant about. No political organization, no party, no ideology. That was, from the first moment, it was the real desire expressed there, that enough of it. Okay, so this, of course, has been transformed, as usual, into a totally authoritarian situation in which you went to these empty events in which nobody has announced really what was going to happen there, if you remember. And then there were these self-appointed speakers who voiced demands, towards the end almost totally idiotic ones, and nobody had a say. So everybody has become an audience instead of a participating political community of any kind, even spontaneous or improvised. So you see, this was indeed rather worse than what I've described. This was, a huge mass demonstration degenerating into a flash mob. It was absolutely, it lost all its silhouette, all its frame, and so of course, in the end, it stopped. The whole thing is dead, it fizzled out. So you see, it's a very, I don't know how important this is, but certainly there's a very strong desire in contemporary society, which is the exact opposite of what you have expressed. And I don't know how important this is. I don't know whether this is something that we should base our strategy on or not, or give up altogether. But most certainly our experience here is that politics have been refused. What is this in Hungary, people will say that these are civil society organizations, civil society opposed to politics. I know this is absurd theoretically. Nevertheless, these are the slogans that are voiced by we are apolitical, anti-political. No, we don't want any of those. And so we won't change the system because we don't recognize any systems, theirs or ours.
The thing
I don't know
is
how
that
important it is.
that's not unique.
Question.
That's not unique to the Hungarian situation. No. The Spanish movement of the squares was heavily inflected by people saying, no politics, we're against all politics, even as they amassed in large numbers in ways that made visible another political opportunity. And so I think the key is not to basically not to believe the available rhetorics of no politics, because if it was really no politics, they would have stayed home.
Maybe.
Not to let the fact that there was dissipation mean that the whole thing is failure, rather than let the fact of dissipation mean, God, we as the left have got to get our act together to use these opportunities and help make them more than they were.
So my impression is, and tell me if I'm wrong, that you basically say that there is this excess of affect or emotion in the crowd that means a gap for the party or a party to move in and organize it and form it into a political movement. And do you mean actually that there is this excess, and the question is only whether it is the fascists or the communists who can siphon off this kind of excess energy? So that is one of the questions. The second connected to that is that, of course, people do not agree, but they would fight it out. Well, if you go to Berlin, they fight it out every 1st of May, and there are real fights. But it doesn't get you anywhere either. So I wonder in what sense you think that they will fight these conflicts of interest or opinion out in the crowd.
Do we want to let other people so I don't talk
please
too much?
And then,
maybe nothing happens on the 1st of May in Berlin, and people will come find it out, but at least they can go out. That's kind of when I realised that in Britain, the 1st of May is the public holidays, that it's like the Monday after. So people don't have that opportunity. I think there is like kind of small meetings, but they don't have the mass to create that energy for that excess. But then when it needs to happen anyway, it does. Like after the election was, and that results were announced, and a protest is going to change the result of democratic action, but it still happened. That was still the energy that had to be released there. There wasn't necessarily going to achieve it, which is what the criticism was from some places, but that wasn't.
A lot of the comment on Berlin, and very interesting thing, of course, with the UK is this Margaret Thatcher got rid of the 1st of May as a public holiday. Instead, we have bank holidays, so we celebrate breaks. But I think that what you mentioned, this fighting, I would totally disagree with you, your analysis on Berlin. And I think it's good actually that the notion of violence is coming into the discussion, because that's always the elephant in the room when we're talking about revolutionary politics, etc., talking about crowds and mobs. But because exactly what's happening in Berlin is that we have real fascists there. And there are areas that are no-go areas for people like myself, because they would beat me up and kill me. And this was, going back to the example of football, there was a map made of Berlin for the African football fans, showing them which areas of the city never to go into while they were visiting, right? So the fact that we have anti-fascists that are violent and fight fascists and the police is what secures all the petty bourgeoisie like myself who like to have our nice civil society in the middle of the city. So that it's not the civil society, and exactly this, we're not political, that was taken from fascism. It's the anti-fascist partisans. So without this violence, the fascists would be everywhere in Berlin.
This is why Simon a few years ago told me that he always helps punks on the streets. Well, I'm invested in security. Yes.
Thank you. I think you're in great danger of writing off the political intent and the political organizations that are present in these demonstrations, and that you instead think that you, the analyst, or the media, if we can grab their attention, should then turn our action into a worthwhile event. And that is organized political resistance, the same as in Berlin. And you say that you're not interested in the content, but you comment on the content. If you're going to comment on the content, you have to take some interest in it. And I totally disagree that people are not coming together for a purpose. The climate change people, they're not going for a day out. There are some people who think have discovered it's a bit of a party. But I'm convinced that the majority of people who go on the G20 demonstrations are there because they are ideologically opposed to the G20. And the people who go on the climate change, and thank God there are more and more young people doing this, are opposed to the conglomerates that are running this world and destroying it.
So let me try to make the position that I'm setting out clear. I am trying to describe what I'm calling the crowd event as a moment of egalitarian discharge. This crowd event creates a gap in what we expect. That gap opens up an opportunity for our situation to be changed, to be different. The primary example was the Paris Commune in my talk. There's been lots and lots of protests since the Paris Commune that they would be good protests or demonstrations, but they're not events in that Badiouian sense that I'm trying to bring out. So, for me, theoretically, what's important is that we recognize that when something is going to be an event, all of the planning in the world doesn't make it happen, right? So it doesn't mean that planning is not good. It doesn't mean that planning can't be really useful. It just means that that's a different level than what I'm talking about. So there are lots of crowd activities, crowds amass, and we can be aware of their dynamics and then also be aware of, sometimes they erupt into something unexpected. Now, I recognize that there are plans, but you can't plan everything. Things happen beyond what you plan. Oh, well then you should actually be in charge of the freaking central committee because nobody else has plans at work. But it seems to me that it is completely wrong to think that you are able to control everything that happens in a setting and completely eliminate all contingency. I mean, I've been in lots of actions where all sorts of small things happened that were not planned for by the organizers. They weren't earth-shattering, but everything was not under the control of organizers. That part I think has to be acknowledged. Also, let me just finish this last part. I am not saying that the party moves in to any kind of a crowd that's amassed and does its thing. That's not the argument. The argument is that when there is a crowd event of the kind of rupture, that you need a party to help make that rupture remain as an event of the people, so that it wasn't just 300,000 people who cared about climate change on a Sunday afternoon marching through Manhattan. It was actually something unexpected. Now, that wasn't something unexpected. Everyone knew it was, so it doesn't count as the movement of a subject. But a party helps make something present as that kind of movement. Again, like Marx, not just saying, oh, well, this isn't clearly the working class because no unions were involved. It was a bunch of women, giving alcohol to soldiers, and that's what started everything off with the National Army. Instead, he feels something else present there and is faithful to that. That's what I'm trying to bring out.
We have been.
Okay.
I find very interesting that this is some sort of a positive sign that we concentrate so much on this agency or subject, or be it an event or crowd, and that we put it into the context of this danger of fascism, which actually is also a consequence of what we haven't been talking about and mentioning all the time. What about a struggle for cultural hegemony? What about struggle for recognition? It has disappeared from this discourse. This is my question to the panel. I would say 15 years ago, or people were talking about the danger of fascism and how to escape and what to do in completely different terms, concepts, and they would still agree that it is all about seizing hegemony in one or another form of classical struggle for recognition. Just to remind you, when Fukuyama talks about the end of history, and he says, well, now there is no this excitement, we don't need this courage, etc. And then says, because this is the end of the struggle for recognition. So he can imagine this emotional charge or courage only if it is about struggle, for recognition. There is, and if there is no struggle for recognition, so who cares? There are no stakes outside of this. And now, obviously, we have been talking all day beyond these old stakes. What's about these stakes? Just think of feminism, think of a post-colonial type of struggles, think of struggles within academic institutions, etc. Do we are we witnessing some sort of turn?
There's an answer to this. I mean, not mine, but there's an answer of society. Why is that? It's an excellent question. Why is that? The plebeians are losing the fight for recognition. The dismantling of the welfare state and the growth of precariat and unemployment has given birth again, after the 19th century, to consider all those who are not members of the capital labor continuum to be unmeritorious. They are considered by the establishment of not really deserving the help of a state that might redistribute goods and services, and not because they don't need that, but because they don't merit it. And so unsuccess is lack of success is a sign of moral inferiority. And this has very deeply penetrated society. And this because indeed of our weaknesses and society's itself weaknesses, you find people, which I find most revolting and which makes me sometimes into revolutionary, when I find subaltern and exploited people accepting this humility, saying, I'm just a little man. We have our needs. I know that I'm not working. I know that I'm not contributing to this, but still we need to live. This kind of serfdom of humiliation that is the case in neoliberal society, and that's very, very deep. And this is why we are losing both the redistribution fight and the recognition fight. And that indeed, of course, explains why there's some kind of maybe impatience with hegemonic fights and all, because the symptoms are very, very worrying. That you find the plebs being an unwitting accomplice to its own oppression, and at least for a while, because of this acceptance of its worthlessness, which I find intolerable, but very little to do. I don't think that my newspaper articles will change that. Okay, although I'm writing, what can I do? But it's really, I think, one of the worst things about this moment in history.
Actually, Gaspar, I don't quite agree. I think the reason that the state is slashing welfare, that the welfare state is under attack, it's not a failure of moral imagination. Because that was implied bourgeoisie as the moral imagination to begin with, and that's not the case. I think it's an attempt to attack labor costs. to drive labor costs down, to make persuade workers, make them accept a lower wage, and to persuade the working class as a whole that it has priced itself out of a job and must lower its price, essentially. And I think that that argument is having a wide impact, which is why there's people believe that workers will be better off without unemployment insurance, without welfare payments, etc. I fully agree it's a race to the bottom, but for the moment, that kind of bourgeois logic is actually having an impact.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay, well, I'm not really agree with you. So that's it. And Jodi, I'm sorry, just one time.
It's all right.
Back into this issue. I think part of the problem is your terminology. You're using what I would describe as non-Marxist terminology. Crowds, the people, even use the term the party or communist party, which to me is being done in an ahistorical, apolitical way. Marxists talk about class, or the workers, not an inchoate concept like the people. They talk about demonstrations and strikes rather than simply crowds. And the concept of crowd is very vague. It can be positive, negative, in between, and the people, of course, can be the petty bourgeoisie, the working class, the upper class, yuppies, kids out for a good time, etc. So I think this terminology and the Communist Party. Which Communist Party are you talking about? The parties of the Comintern, the Third International, the parties of the Fourth International. These are all different political organizations which have memberships and organizational structures. And your terminology strikes me as just not sufficiently precise, which is why I think that eyebrows are going up and hackles are being raised, because you're creating a lot of questions.
Okay, I'm just jumping in here to answer this. First, I think you're wrong when you say that the people is not a Marxist term. Lukács says that it was Lenin who was able to take the peasants and the proletariat and create a new revolutionary concept of the people. We have in the Maoist history an idea of people. We have in the 60s and 70s people struggle all over the non-aligned nations. So I think people is absolutely a Marxist concept, and even broader, a communist concept that has an important historical legacy. Second, it should not just be liberal democracy that is able to speak in abstract and universal terms about its categories, right? We never just say, oh, democracy. Oh, do you mean the Democrats? Which Democratic Party? Which party do you mean? Do you mean these particular British parties in the 19th century? No, nobody ever says that, and allows people to talk about liberalism and democracy in abstract terms, and it's time that Marxists and communists can do that as well again with our terminology. So I am going to use the party in this abstracted sense, deliberately trying to disembed it from its overdetermination within a specific 20th century history. You said that Marxists only talked about in class terms. Well, Marxists also have always talked about the masses. The people also fits with the concept of the masses. Crowds, I'll give you that one, but I do find Lenin is actually really great in one of his essays on the 1905 revolution when he talks about how the crowds and working he uses the back and forth, working people and the crowds as how they exceeded and went further than the party was able to do. I mean, and it's so great. There's a passage where he's trashing Plekhanov. He's like, the party was saying, what is to be done, and the people were saying, what are we to do now? And so I love his kind of self-critique there. So I think that, I think that we can update and re-envision and reimagine a Marxist vocabulary.
Just when we have been talking about fascism, just to remind you actually that International Workers and Communist Movement 35, Congress of Comintern 35, it was precisely Georgy Dimitrov who actually introduced the concept of people into the strategy of international communist movement to fight fascism, redefining it and introducing the famous concept of the popular front, redefining the concept of nation, concept of people, and he would say, in a purely antagonistic terms, defining it to people belong all those who fight fascism, and then he would taxatively, petit bourgeois, the teachers, small, etc., like a huge, it was a line of professions. And it was interesting that People's Front was not so successfully applied in Spain, but Yugoslav Communist Party, which was 41 very small illegal party, how many? Few thousand?
300 in Slovenia.
Only 300 in Slovenia, altogether 8,000 illegal party, which is completely doesn't exist, comes with the strategy of the Volksfront and ends in a 4-year the war with like 800,000 soldiers, winning the war, and even the former Yugoslavia was defined according to the strategy of a People's Front. If you would read these decisions made 43 in Jajce, this is the new constitution of Yugoslavia. It starts with one sentence: the people of Yugoslavia unite according to the common fight against fascism. No cultural identity, no language, no history, nothing mentioned. This is only one thing. What unites all these people is that they fight fascism. Jelen, you wanted probably coming from former Yugoslavia, they want to add something. Jelen,
I just want to build up an example from the former Yugoslavia, because we did have fascists and anti-fascists, and it's through an example of also terminology. It's a new monument that was built in the city of Split, which has also a very long anti-fascist tradition, and it was set up for a paramilitary formation from the 1990s, named after an Ustasha general, Rafael Boban, and the name of the monument is also Hos, and on the monument it also says Zadom Spremni, which is the fascist salute, and it was established under, while the mayor is from the Social Democratic Party, and so there's a lot of media hype about this, how you're building a pro-fascist monument, and the guys from the unit that were there said, well, we are actually anti-fascist because we were fighting Milosevic's fascism. We were fighting Serbian fascism in the 90s, and so now it's this complete bizarre blurring of what is fascism and what is anti-fascism, and I think in Serbia is also a very similar thing going on with the Chetniks, who are now also become part of the anti-fascist coalition. So actually young people in this region, or even older people, everyone, doesn't even know what fascism or anti-fascism is, because it's being completely blurred in terms of terminology. And just one comment on the crowd, because I was attending a mass crowd and a rally 2 weeks ago in Zagreb, which is called 100% for Croatia. It's right-wing, veteran mobilization, guys dressed in black, so it's like they're looking like Ustasha, they're talking like Ustasha, they're carrying Ustasha flags, and they're claiming no, we're for complete unity. And it was weird because this 100% for Croatia rally, which also had a lot of labor unions there, also had all these weird, not weird, but they had like it was weird that there were these Japanese and Korean tourists mingling around, not knowing what was going on for this pure cleansing of Croatia with this 100%. So it's very strange in the region of how do we position ourselves in terms of these terms of fascism and anti-fascism, because they're getting completely blurred in the contemporary discourse.
Yeah.
My question is like more conceptual than like purely related to Yugoslav history, but can be also seen as stemming from Yugoslav history. We talk now, and it's I mean, for us who are searching for something, these are these talks that we speak about crowd, that we speak about potentiality, that we speak about the resistance, that we speak about the possibility, that we speak about the depression that stems from this unfulfilled possibility, like this kind of coitus interruptus of desire that wanted something and it didn't fulfill anything. Then we also, of course, speak about organization. And the left today is sort of in a double, like a double trap. In one hand, it criticizes welfare state and social state apparatus. In another hand, it also defends it, because like what's happening now is like much worse. So like you can also see like return to, like now to refer to Yugoslav condition, to return to like self-managed socialist Yugoslavia as like a utopia per se. But okay, like we I mean all of us, we obviously want something more. So the thing that was related, connected to a modern political thinking, which I think was very much important, and also important for mobilization, for organization, for the possibility, for like a reason why, was the concept of horizon. So I wonder. I mean, this is the question to actually all of you. Okay, I know it's a difficult question, but we are here to discuss such questions.
We had actually a conference of former West on this topic in Istanbul like 4 years ago, 2010, December 2010, on Horizon. We haven't mentioned it. Rastko, please.
You've been
About
teaching
Horizon.
a seminar on this, right?
yeah, but that was it was more sociologist. About Horizon. A concrete, I would answer by the concrete example of refusal of politics. Now, people nowadays massively refuse politics. You also have low turnouts at elections and all those symptoms. Now, within the horizon of a traditional left, abolition of politics is one of the goals. So this spontaneous refusal of politics is refusal of this actually existing historical way how politics is practiced and institutionalized. It's not articulated because they were not reading young Marx or on Jewish graduates and the like, but they feel that something is wrong. So the Aufhebung of the so-called relatively autonomous sphere of politics is, within the left horizon, one of the traditional goals. How to achieve it, of course, is a practical question. Self-management was one of the answers. The historical experience is a mixed one. What else could it be? And, well, we should analyze this experience and set for the abolition of politics, That was a Leninist, political goal as well. So.
Administration of things.
Yeah.
I guess I have two responses. One, I think that I'm actually think that the left should not have the end of politics as its goal. And I think that that's one of the parts of the left tradition that we can jettison. And I think, and I actually think that for Lacanian reasons, right? That if we're fundamentally alienated and divided, there's always going to be something else that will prevent us from being fully with other people or even with ourselves. So the idea that there could be something that's not political with around that division, I think is well, it's a fantasy hiding
it's
that
a
division.
romantic, radical humanism of early Marx and
Right.
company. Yeah.
So I would say that a better Marxism will be a Lacanian Marxism that recognizes this split. On the horizon, so my most recent book is called The Communist Horizon, and I actually firmly believe that communism is still the horizon of our politics. President of Bolivia, Alvaro Garcia Linera, actually said that for his movement, or he's vice president of Bolivia with,
Evo Morales.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. It's my old age. Okay, so Eva Morales, with Eva Morales, I mean, and Garcia Linera said in response to an interviewer's questions like, what is the horizon of their politics? He's like, our eyes are firmly set on the communist horizon. That part of our political possibility is not gone yet. And I think primarily we know this to be the case because there's still capitalism, right? And communism was always our ability to say we do not have to have a capitalist economic system. There is something else. So for me, horizon is still a meaningful concept, but I also understand it as the division that establishes where we are, right? The division that's the perspective from which we see. So it's not just this kind of goal, but more like how it is that we can see our world from the standpoint of its dominant antagonism.
Nice last word. Nice last word.
If there are one more last word, so we will declare it as the last word of today's session. Thank you very much.